Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. You are most welcome here. When I went to my local Dollar Tree and they had out their fall and Halloween merchandise, they had this baking mold, and it has molds for a little ghost, a jack-o'-lantern, a bat, and a skull. And I thought, I really want to make something with that. And I decided to also draw inspiration from some of my favorite author illustrators. Let's go have some fun. I'm going to create 2 faux books, and the first author illustrator I've chosen is Edward Gorey. I love Edward Gorey's sort of quirky stories and style. This is a book that I have, which is a collection of his works. You might recognize Edward Gorey's work from the titles of Mystery, the TV show Mystery. I'm going to include a link in the description to the Edward Gorey house, and they have a website, so if you like Edward Gorey, you can purchase all kinds of cool stuff there. You can also visit Edward Gorey House. It's a museum, and that's located on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And the second illustrator I've chosen is Tomie dePaola. I have this book, it's a children's book called The Vanishing Pumpkin, and I just love his art style as well. I'm going to include a link to the Tomie dePaola website in the description. So turning to the baking mold from the Dollar Tree, I wanted to have a cast element in each of these books. So I'm going to use some plaster of Paris and make plaster casts from this baking mold. Now for this baking mold, it was about 3 tablespoons of plaster per figure. And I just mixed that according to the package directions. Now for 2 of them, I did not oil the mold, and for 2 of them I did, and I didn't notice any difference in how easy it was to remove them. The molds came out very well, and it was quite easy to remove them. When I'm working with a powdered plaster of Paris, I usually use a respirator and I pour it outdoors or in a very well ventilated area. You don't want to inhale the powder. Now for your own personal project, you could use authentic art from whichever author you choose. You could find a used book and take it apart, or you could download images or scan images and then print them out. For the purpose of this video, I did not want to use copyrighted work, so I decided to use DALL-E, which is an artificial intelligence that will generate images for you. And it will generate images in a particular style. So what I have here is some images that I already generated, and I asked DALL-E to generate images in the style of Tomie dePaola and in the style of Edward Gorey. And I'm going to show you how you do that. First, you do have to make an account. It's free, but it does take some time for you to get the account. Once you have the account, then you have a certain number of credits, and in DALL-E, each image is 1 credit. You can purchase more credits if you want to. So I typed skeleton in a spooky field with trees, book cover by Tomie dePaola. And I love the covers that I got from that particular request. You have to experiment with the requests a little bit, and if you get one that you like but you'd like to see variations, you can do that as well. Now for my Tomie dePaola book, I only need a cover. I originally thought I would have a cover and an inside. That's what I'm going to do for the Edward Gorey book, but then I decided I would just have a cover. So I'm going to choose this image on the left because I love the colors in it. So I'm going to make the Edward Gorey book first, and I just sort of prototyped the idea out of paper. So basically I'm going to make a tray style box out of cardboard, and I'm going to have a cover which is basically just a flat piece of cardboard, and I'm going to attach the box to the cover. Now I've chosen to use the ghost for this Edward Gorey book, and I had DALL-E generate this image of a library, and I had to edit it a little bit to make it look a little bit more like an Edward Gorey image, and I also edited it to look like the figure in it was the shadow of this cast of a ghost. Now my dimensions for the back piece of cardboard, the one that is the cover, are 7.5 inches tall by 10 3/4 inches wide. Because this is going to be standing up, I want the bottom of the box to be flush with the bottom of the cover, but I want a little bit of overlap at the top and on the edges. And ultimately,
I felt like this piece of cardboard really wasn't quite big enough for the box that I made. And that is probably because maybe I made the box a little too big, maybe I made the piece of cardboard for the cover a little bit too small. So you could go maybe a little bit larger with this, maybe 8 inches by 11 inches or 7 3/4 by 11 inches. And I'm going to be making this out of what I call kitchen cardboard, so I've saved up a bunch of boxes, and you want a really large piece if possible for that cover, so a large cereal box is what I'm going to use for that. So the cover is just a rectangle. For the box, my box is 4 inches wide and my sides are 2 inches high. I wanted it to be deep enough for me to place the little ghost and have it appear that that shadow was his shadow, so I wanted it a little bit behind him. Now the height of the box is 7.5 inches. That's on the inside. Again, the sides of it are 2 inches each, but that's why I made the cover piece 7 3/4, so I'd have a 1/4 inch boundary over the top. You don't have to use these dimensions, of course. Even if you're using my images, you might choose to make your box different dimensions. Now I tried to work with the natural folds that were already in this cracker box. I really think that was a mistake. If you don't have a box that's big enough, maybe cut separate pieces that are the right size, because it was just, I had to actually work against the folds in a couple of places, and it was just tricky, and I think my box is a little wonky, my inside box. So I'd say just cut rectangles that are exactly the right size and then fasten the thing together. Once you have it all cut, just fasten it together. I used a little bit of masking tape. And so for those sides, I did have, for most of the sides, a little bit of a tab so that I could fold the tab over and tape it so that there wasn't a gap in the corners. Now what I'd like to do is have something that looks like pages around the edges of the box. So I have this large pad, it's 18 by 24 inches of 50-pound paper. And I ended up doubling up the paper, so if you have a heavier weight paper, I think that would be better. The only reason I doubled it up is so that it would absolutely cover that box, so that you couldn't see the printing on the box through it. So if you have a box that doesn't have any printing on it, obviously that would be ideal. But otherwise, the printing has to go somewhere, either around those edges where you want it to look like paper, or on the inside where we're going to be putting our image, and you're going to want to make sure that that doesn't show through. So what I did was I cut strips of this paper that were wide enough, so 2 inches, to cover the edge, and then a little bit of extra on each side to fold it over. And what I'm going to do is score this to look like, again, like the edge of a book where you can see all of the pages. So I'm going to score straight lines down this. And I don't have any tools really for working with paper. Maybe you do if you do a lot of paper craft. So what I ended up using was a tiny little screwdriver to score the paper. And I was just careful to make sure I didn't cut through the paper by accident with the screwdriver. Now once that was scored, I wanted to paint over it to highlight the scores and also to make it look a little bit like an old book. Now with the Edward Gorey book, because the work is very gray and black and white, I decided to use a gray palette for the edges of the book. And I'm using an acrylic paint by Apple Barrel. I started with granite, but I'm going to recommend you just go ahead and start with pewter. So I started with granite and sort of brushed it over, but then I switched to pewter, which is a darker gray. And I'm going to recommend you follow this process. Dry brush that against the scores that you put in. That's going to highlight them the best. When I was dry brushing with the scores, it really wasn't bringing them out. But if you can dry brush against them and try not to get the paint too heavy, but a little bit of variation is fine, then those scores will really be emphasized and it will look like the edges of paper. Once I was finished dry brushing over the scores, I just mixed some water with the paint and then washed it over the paper. So this won't obscure the scores, it will just give it all a nice textury look, and the scores won't look quite so stark as when you first do them. Now I did, as I said, double that up. So I had painted another piece of paper that was going to be behind this piece, and that was mostly just sort of practicing with the technique. So I glued that using Mod Podge to the back of the piece that has the scores and the paint technique on it. And then I just glued that around my box and then folded over the edges on the inside and on the bottom and glued those down. And I used some clips to hold it in place while it was drying. But you could also just press it down and dry it with a heat tool to get it to dry quickly. Now you can see I cut a larger backing. I think it was just a 1/4 inch larger on each dimension from a larger cereal box. And you can see that it gives me a good look of a book. So then I wanted to do the inside of the box, so I cut out my image so that it would have the ghost shadow in it to fit the inside of the box. And that took a little bit of fiddling. So I traced around the box and then cut on the inside of the tracing, but then I had to cut off little bits to get it to fit in there. I then cut the rest of the bookcase to fit in one side, and because the picture isn't large enough, I printed another copy of the picture to give me some books to fit on the other side. Now I'm just going to have the books around the sides. I want to do something different for the top and the bottom. You usually don't have books on the floor or the ceiling. So for the top and the bottom, you could use a piece of construction paper or a piece of paper that you painted, whatever color you wanted. I happen to have this vinyl, which I got at the Dollar Tree, and I had bought it just sort of wondering what might I do with this because I don't have a Cricut. I kind of just wanted to see what it might be good for. And now I'm sort of happy to get rid of it and decided to use it on this project. So it is experimental, and I'd say it worked well in some ways and not so well in other ways. So the first thing I wanted to do is see if I could just make it look less shiny. And if you are going to use vinyl, I think you can buy vinyl that looks like it's leather. And that's what I would have chosen if I had actually gone out and bought vinyl for this project. I would have gotten a nice piece of vinyl which looked like leather. But since I don't have that, what I did was I used just a regular kitchen sponge, and I sponged some of the pewter paint over this, and then I sponged some black acrylic paint over that. Now it isn't just paint, it's paint mixed with Mod Podge, because I was afraid that paint wouldn't adhere and it would scrape off. And this actually worked really well. I was able to paint this with a combination of paint mixed with Mod Podge, and the paint stayed on, and it gave me, I thought, a pretty cool finish. So I cut that up and I used it for the bottom and the ceiling, the floor and the ceiling of my library inside the box. And then I glued my image of the ghost and the books inside. And again, just used Mod Podge to glue that inside. With the vinyl, of course, it has an adhesive backing, so I didn't need to use any glue for that. Now I really liked the way that that looked, so I decided to use the same technique over the cover. It has almost a marbly kind of look, not really a leather look, but sort of a marbled paper look, which I thought was perfect for this book. So I put a piece over what is going to be the inside of the book, and then I put a piece over what is going to be the outside of the book, and that piece is a little larger, and I folded that over the edges onto the inside, thinking that I really want the outside to look nicer. But if you're doing this, before you do this, I would recommend you skip to a later step where I put a piece of wire along the top and the bottom of this book cover, because I decided after I created it that I wanted it to be sort of posable, so I could have the book cover open exactly as much as I wanted, and also so that I could make the spine look a little more realistic. So I do use some heavy wire, and you'll see that a little bit later, which I duct tape on the inside at the top and the bottom, and then I do the paint technique over the duct tape, and it works fine over duct tape as well. But I think what I would want to do is duct tape the wire down and then do the vinyl over the duct tape. Do it in that order. So cover with vinyl, dab with paint mixed with Mod Podge on both sides to get that nice effect. Okay, and here I am duct taping that pretty heavy gauge galvanized steel wire. I don't know if a lighter gauge wire would work. I guess it would depend on how thick the cardboard is, but this wire worked really well. And this odd little image is the one I chose for the library cover. I felt like this was the most gory thing, gory as in Edward Gorey thing, that DALL-E had generated, and I kept the weird words. The words are just, I think, really funny. Mr. Crafts the Charm says it's sort of like when you're in a dream and you're trying to read something and it looks like words, but it just doesn't make sense. And I thought that was great for a Halloween piece of art or craft. So I'm going to keep that and put that somewhere on the cover. But what I decided is I would like maybe just a little bit of detail. So I'm going to paint some gold stripes, and I'm using a combination of this metallic or Deco Art metallic, champagne gold, and rich espresso. And that's just because I liked that color when I mixed them together. I thought one was too light and one was too dark on their own. And I'm using a little bit of painter's tape, and you can see I put that on my sweater several times before I put it on the book because I was afraid that if I put down tape on this book it might pull up the finish. But I had no trouble with it pulling up the finish when I had put it on my sweater. So I put 2 gold stripes at the bottom and 1 at the top. And then I decided that my label would be sort of near the top of the book, and I just painted around that with the gold. I want to paint the label a little bit before I adhere it on there, and I also want to paint the ghost. So I'm going to use some black paint first, and I'm just doing his eyes and his mouth, which are depressed. And then I decided to paint black in the other depressed areas. Those are sort of shadowy, and then I used the paint to draw more shading down the ghost, and then I mixed some water in it and did lighter shading near the top. I wanted shading down the sides, and then I also did a little shading around his eyes. I did some around his mouth. I didn't like that. I ended up painting over that, and then I used that wet black paint to go over the label just to make it less white. Now I'm going to brush some white over all of that shading so that it just looks more like shadow. It isn't so stark. And I really liked the effect of that, painting the white over the black and the gray, and I felt that it gave me something like a gory sort of look on this ghost. And as I mentioned, I did sponge paint that duct tape. Even though on video you can't really see it, it is quite black and it doesn't look like the paint technique, so I sponge painted over it. And you can see the wire, you know, it's a bump, but the paint technique really matched up quite well. And now we can assemble this. So I used Mod Podge to put the label on, and I Mod Podged over the label edges, the whole label and the label edges. And then I just used hot glue to put the box on. I'm not sure that that's going to hold very well, and I'm not sure what is the best thing to use to glue this on. I also used hot glue to glue the ghost in, and that's how it looks. Now for the Tomie dePaola book, I decided I wanted to try a follow me eye effect in the skull. So I did watch a monster tutorials video, and I'll include a link to that below. And I don't have the correct equipment to do what Eduardo did in that video, but I'm going to try something. So I have some, this is air dry clay, and I thought I would try to use that as a mold for eyes. And I have these little beads which fit pretty well inside the eyes of the skull. So what I did was I pushed the bead into the air dry clay, and you want basically a half circle mold. So don't push it in all the way. I push it so I have basically a half circle there. I'm only showing you making one. I already made one to see if this would work. So now I'm going to use resin, and this is UV resin. So I'm pouring that into that mold, and then I'm using a UV flashlight. So if you have one of these, just be really careful with them. You don't want to look at them. And 3 minutes holding that over. So when 3 minutes was done, I removed it from the air dry clay, and it was a little mucky, had a little bit of the air dry clay on it, but I was able to wash that off with some water. Now I used a Sharpie to mark a circle, and I tried to get that's on the dome, so the underside. I tried to get that as centered as I possibly could. When I had done both of the eyes, they weren't both centered, so I was able to remove the Sharpie with some alcohol, dried it off, and tried again. So then I put them in the skull, but they weren't recessed enough. The skull openings are fairly flat. So I just used my screwdriver, and I had to dig out quite a lot of plaster there. But I dug out a lot of plaster from each eye socket until when I put my little eyeballs in, they were completely recessed. And if I put them in the skull correctly, so that the eyes are pretty much centered, it really does have a follow me eye effect. I'm trying to show it here, but if you take that little skull, you put it below, above, or to the left or the right, it does look like it's looking at you. Now, for the book with the skull, what I decided was to use that image that DALL-E had generated, but I put my own title on it. I needed it to be a size that would work with this cast skull, so I needed it to be fairly large. The whole image was going to be way too large if I made sure that the skull would fit. So I cropped off the top of it, which had the funny words that didn't make sense, and I just decided to call it the Lost Skeleton, which I know is kind of sad, but I don't know, I just came up with a name, and that's what I came up with. And I don't think he's very lost, because I do think in the background there that we can see some skeletons having a sort of a picnic, so I think he's going to be fine. But in order to print this on my ordinary printer, I did have to print it in 2 pieces. And Adobe Acrobat will do that for you if you choose tiling. So I saved it out as a PDF and opened it up and printed it to tile. So it's 2 pieces. And so I just need to cut off the white and hope that I can line it up well enough that it looks like it's one image. Now for the skull to work, it's really too large, no matter what. It's too long, and honestly, I think it's kind of a weird looking skull. I don't really like it. I need it to be cuter because that image that DALL-E generated is so cute. So I cut it off, so like the lower jaw, basically. So I cut it off so that the upper teeth are the bottom of the skull, and I used my little saw for that. And you can see that it fits much better. But I also wanted it to be just a little narrower, and maybe I shouldn't have done that because you can still see some of the drawing around the sides, but that's what I did. I made it a little narrower as well. And then I just took a sanding block, and I did this outside because of the dust, but I brought it outside and just softened where I had cut it. Now I used hot glue to adhere the eyes inside the skull, and this was the thing I was the most nervous about because the positioning of those really is important. And a little dab of hot glue did not work, but when I put a good glob in there, it adhered just fine. And then this is the other thing I was nervous about, was painting this. And I probably should have painted it before I put the eyes in, since I could always cast another one, but the eyes were a little tricky to make. But I just did features in black, and I wanted to do around the face in black. This is going to be recessed in the image, but I wanted it to look like a drawing that was outlined in black. So I did between the teeth, and around the eyes and inside the nose cavity. And then I just sort of like I did with the ghost, I just took white and went over that to soften it. So for this one, this is not going to be a book that opens, but it still needs to be basically a box. It's just a box that doesn't open. And because it's so large, I really don't have a flat piece of cardboard that's big enough. So it's going to have to incorporate a fold from a box. So it's a little bit flimsy there, so I do end up gluing some cardboard across that fold so that it's just a little stiffer. So I did the same basic thing for the edges, so I'm not going to belabor that, but instead of using gray, this time I used burnt umber because I wanted it to be more tan. Then I mixed that with white before I brushed it on. For the cover, I just used the black. I didn't do any kind of painting technique on it because the cover of the image is going to be most of the front, so you're not really going to see that black that much. And I just Mod Podged that over the front cover, and I covered my edges with the paper and then glued that around the back. Now for the skeleton, this is the interesting part. I drew around the skull over my little skeleton's head, and then just very carefully cut it out. And I was able to cut it so that I could sort of jam it in there. So I didn't glue that or anything, but you certainly could. Or you could glue it to the back of the book, put something between that and the back of the book to really secure it. Mine was perfectly secure, just stuck through the cardboard on the front. I wanted to put something inside the book though, so that it would just reinforce the structure of the book, hold those sides, which I had glued on, and it would also be behind that little skull in case it did decide to move. So I just used some plastic bags, and I taped them down just so they wouldn't get in the way while I was gluing the book together. And I just used hot glue to glue the top to the edges of the book. And I needed to reinforce that with more hot glue after it started to come up, so that may not be the best way to glue it. And then I have just a tiny bit of this vinyl left after covering both the front and the back with it. So I just cut some strips. The first strip is to cover that side, the binding. So that just goes around the front and the back. And then I did another strip on the right edge. I'm not sure if I showed that, but the right edge was a little messy. All right, and here's the finished Edward Gorey book. And here's the finished skeleton book. And watch his little eyes, he's looking at you. I love that effect.
So what did you think of our haunted books? Did you have a favorite? If so, please tell me in the comments. I think that my favorite was the Tomie dePaola book with the following eyes, just because I didn't know that I would be able to make something like that. I didn't know that it would work so well. And so really a big shout out to Eduardo at Monster Tutorials, because he gave a really great tutorial on how to make those, and I will include a link in the description. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. That tells me that you like this sort of content and I should bring you more. And if you like this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.